All right. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the Boca Podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Holritz. Good to have you here today. Happy Friday to those of you that are live streaming with us. For those of you that are not live streaming with us, make sure to subscribe to Boca, B-O-K-H podcast on Instagram. Keep up to date with the upcoming live stream schedule so you can come be part of the conversation. For those of you that are live streaming, don't be shy. Ask questions, comment, join the conversation. We want this to be a group discussion. And on that note, I want to introduce my brand new guest here on the Boca Podcast today. Jasmin Blais is here, and Jasmin. Okay, there we go. We got you added in. We're gonna switch you over here too. All kinds of fun little technical things here today. Jasmin is very gracious in allowing me to do this interview today on a relatively new platform to us. So any potential technical glitches along the way, we'll ask for forgiveness in advance. But thanks, Jasmin, for being willing to do this interview. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's gonna be fun.
Well, and we're going to talk. Well, I mean, for those that saw the title earlier before they came to this live stream, they may already know. But we're going to talk today about how to pivot to something new, and we'll give more context to that conversation here in just a little bit. But will you do me a favor and introduce yourself to our guests? I know that you joined me on the Newbie podcast, but this is, of course, the Boca podcast, and I would love for our listeners, our community, to get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, for sure. Well, first, I'm excited to be here. I love chatting all things photo. So just wanted to add that in. But yeah, so I am a photographer. I'm based in Saskatchewan, Canada. So that's like right in the middle of Canada. So I have been shooting since 2012 and I jumped into weddings in 2014. I also am a teacher as well. And I think we'll kind of get into that a little bit later, but I mainly focus on wedding photography as well as photo education. I mentor other photographers and kind of help them pivot into photography and kind of create a roadmap of where to go next and all that good stuff. So yeah, I love it.
Cool. Well, thanks for making that introduction. I want to say hello, first of all, to Sue, saying hi from Sun Valley. And we also have, let's see, we've got Sharonda. I think, Sharonda's here from Dallas. Thanks for saying hello, Sharonda. And for anybody else who is live streaming with us, please don't be shy. Join in the conversation, say hello. And then as we get into the discussion, of course, make sure to ask questions and comment along the way, share from your experiences as well. And then Jasmin, I'm going to, and again, everybody forgive me as I'm fumbling my way around a new control panel here, but I want to just pop up your website here on screen for everybody who is live streaming with us. And so we'll do that here real quick. Yes, we pushed the right button. Cool. So we've got your website there. And for anybody who's not live streaming, if you go to jcphotographysk.com, we'll link to this, of course, in the show notes at bocapodcast.com. You can see Jasmin's website. And by the way, Jasmin, your beautiful work as well. You all can go link to that. And then, of course, we'll also link to JC Photography SK, Jasmin's Instagram account in the show notes as well, bocapodcast.com. Make sure you go check out her work there. But we'll make sure to link to all of those. In fact, for those of you listening in, if you don't take advantage of the show notes, we do link to all the resources there in the show notes at bocapodcast.com. Once we post each episode, the audio version of the episode, once that goes live, you can go check out the show notes as well. Jasmin, let's go ahead and get into the conversation at hand, though. We're talking about this idea about how to pivot to something new. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't very long ago, right, that you actually made a pretty significant pivot.
Yeah. So like I said before, I am a teacher. I've been teaching since about 2012, 2013. And I love it. It was just a natural thing to kind of jump into after I graduated. I did some coaching, basketball. I did a lot of work with youth and all that stuff. So jumping into teaching and that kind of avenue was natural, and I loved it. So fast forward 2019, we had our first child, and then 2021, our second child. And coming off of mat leave, and I should say in Canada.
I love how you just say that very nonchalantly too. We had a child. Oh yeah, and then we threw another child in the mix.
Yeah.
By the way.
Well, I mean, I don't know. It's the pandemic. What else are you supposed to do? No, I'm just kidding.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think there were a number of babies born probably, huh?
Yeah, a lot of COVID babies. Um, so yeah, and in Canada, I should say our maternity leaves are a year. Actually, they can go up to 18 months. So we're
That's
super
amazing.
fortunate here. Yeah. Yeah. So we're able to have that time. With that, I was set to come back in the fall, this fall, and I've already been off for close to a year. And I decided that just the season of life I was in, that this was a great transition into full time photography. And I should say, like, yeah, where my husband, he has a salary job. I was going to put it out there just so everybody kind of understands the context of the situation
For
that we're in.
context, yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And sorry, yeah, we have both our kids are under the age of 4, so super chaotic at home.
Right.
Yeah, it's if you hear a kid, just screaming, it's just my kids upstairs not wanting to eat. So, but yeah, so that's kind of the jump that I made. And for that, I do want to say that because it was October and because I am in Saskatchewan, we do have the 4 seasons, and we're right now we're actually winding down our busy season and we're jumping into slow season, and that's usually from December all the way up to like April. So it's a good chunk of the year where your shooting is very minimal and you kind of have to adjust to it. And so um just kind of making that transition was a little bit scary, but um it is what it is, and I'm excited to talk about it. I'm excited to kind of talk about making a pivot in your 30s and what that looks like and how to navigate it, and kind of squash that voice in your head that's your self-doubt monster. So
That fear, yeah. Well, and of
yeah.
course, we have a variety of listeners that are going to be not just in their 30s, maybe in their 20s and their 40s or otherwise as well. So this is, I think a lot of the principles probably that we'll get into today are relevant regardless of age. What we're really focusing on here is the notion of making a pretty significant change. In this case, in a career, a pivot in a career, right? You're a full-time teacher and now you're going to let that full-time career go for the sake of focusing on photography. Is that right?
Yeah, so I transitioned to half-time teaching
Okay.
about 6 years, well, 5 years ago. But I also like substitute taught in between, so it was
Sure.
basically full-time teaching with that, just a little bit more flexible. Um, yeah, so just just making that transition in itself, whether that's teaching or whatever kind of career, when you go from a salary to a job that is just it fluctuates, a money,
Yeah,
it
we're
is
going from
very
a like
scary.
a normal job to a not normal job, right? We go
Yeah,
from knowing
yeah,
exactly what we're gonna make and what our schedule is and what exactly we're supposed to do day to day to a place where it's on us. We have to figure it
yeah,
all out.
yeah,
And there are a lot
yeah.
of fears associated with that. And maybe we can kind of start the conversation just talking about what those fears are, because I'm sure our listeners, viewers can probably relate to some of those, especially if they're at a point in their, whether it's they're wanting to make a pivot in a career like you are doing,
Yeah.
or maybe they have an established photography business and they're like, you know what, this is just not what I want to do, or it's not working out from a business standpoint. I want to make a change, go in a different
Hmm.
direction with my business. There's an opportunity for a pivot. Naturally, with that pivot come quite a few fears.
Hmm.
And so I'd love for you just to share some of the fears that you had to kind of face in this process, if you don't mind.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a couple biggest fears that I think come naturally with doing anything new. And I made a list because I still wanted to make sure that I kind of went over them. First one is finances. Second one, you're afraid of what people will think. That is kind of one of the biggest things. Um, you're afraid of letting others down. Um, and then rejection as well. The fear of, quote unquote, looking stupid, right? And especially with something like social media where everything's like so accessible and you kind of see everybody's like highlights. You're afraid that like when things get hard, I'm gonna look stupid, or I tried something and I'm gonna look dumb and people are gonna be there to
Mm,
say I told you so, or
mm,
whatever. And I think whether you are 20 years old and you start your photography career, or you're you know, 50 and you're doing a pivot, because like if we're being honest here, the longevity of a photography career isn't the same as a teaching career. Usually, I should say that. In the sense of, um, I probably won't be shooting weddings when I'm 55, where I could still teach if I wanted to, because, I can,
The
it's
physical
just,
demands are different.
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That wedding hangover is real, that photographers talk about. Um, and so that, it's just in any case kind of pivoting into something new. With finances though, going from a salary, knowing like, okay, every 2 weeks I'm making X amount, if my kids, need to go to the to the dentist or whatever, I know I have coverage, that this is, it's a, going into my retirement, I don't even have to think about it, because it's happening, I don't have to, my employer is doing that for me. I don't have to think about it. So I guess if you want to talk about in regards to that, sure, that's easy, but let's like flip it around and let's look on the other side, because I think that's what stops people from making a pivot, is something might be harder, but it's not harder, it's just new. Everything that's new is harder, right? Like, I mean, for example, like I'm watching my daughter just started walking like a week
Mm.
ago, and like she didn't fall down once and was like, okay, great, I'm done, I'm not going to walk again. I fell down once, it was hard, I'm good, I'm done. No, like she fell and fell and fell and fell, and now she's walking. If you just kind of use that analogy, it's just like, okay, like I know this is going to be hard and I'm going to keep trying at it. And so with finances, understanding that, like, hey, when busy season starts, I'm going to have, a large chunk of money coming in, or hopefully, or I'm going to, be available more to shoot. And then when slow season, I'm just have to just embrace this season and understand that this is not forever. This is just right now. And if I
Sure.
want to start something new in the busy season, then do it. It's okay. A book I do want to recommend, that I love is You're a Badass at Making Money. That's a great book. It just talks about money mindset. So if that is one of the biggest hurdles for you right now, is going into entrepreneurship or investing in something new, or whatever that may be, it's a really good book to kind of put things into perspective, and it doesn't make money seem that scary. Like, look, money ebbs and flows. Like, yes, that book, yes, money ebbs and flows. Like, that's just what it is. Like, and with that, understand that when you are making a salary, you know that, okay, every 2 weeks I get this amount. Every year I'm going to increase this amount, or whatever. It's going to increase to this amount. Sometimes contracts change and it increases a little bit, little bit, little bit. Okay, that's great. But think of it now as an entrepreneur, and if we're talking about photography or whatever, you don't have somebody telling you how much you're worth it. You get to decide that. You get to decide how much money you make in a year. You get to decide how many clients you want to book. Like, you have control over it. You don't have somebody telling you that you're worth X amount of dollars. You know.
Yeah.
So
Let me
think of
jump in
that.
real quick though, Jasmine, because I know I want to get to I want to let's kind of compartmentalize. We'll talk about the fears here first, because I've got
Yeah.
a follow up question or two for you in regards to these fears that you shared, and then we'll kind of talk about the practical application, the next steps for our listeners if they are ready to make that pivot. How do they go about facing those fears and ultimately make those changes? I know you've got, I think you said 5 different points to share with that, but in this particular case, facing first of all that the fears associated with finances are very real, and
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there's a particular thing that you did to plan for that, like very tangibly, whether it was putting together a budget or getting some financial management software and starting to use that, or what it is that you did in order to plan for that effectively. Because a lot of times fears, and I speak from personal experience by the way as well, fears are unfounded in many
Mhm.
cases, right? We build
Mhm.
this idea up in our head and make it a lot worse than it actually is, kind of what you were alluding to a few minutes ago. And the reality is that if we have some level of knowledge and understanding about what it is that we're getting ready to do, we can help mitigate that sense of fear. I'm afraid that I'm not going to be able to make some money. Okay, sure. And there are no guarantees as a business owner. But at the end of the day, if we actually go into it with intention, very
Mhm.
specific and clear intention, number one, and then two, a strategy, how
Yeah.
we're going to go about making or ultimately launching and then building a business in order to generate the necessary revenue, then at least we have direction. If we have no direction and we're lost because we don't have the knowledge, naturally that fear is going to be way bigger than it needs to be, right? So I'd love to hear, did you go into this transition process with a very specific plan, or was it something that you kind of figured out as you went along?
Yeah, I love that question. Okay, so when I was on maternity leave, my income obviously out of busy season, because I didn't shoot for a good chunk of the year because obviously I just had a baby. So my income was already cut down because of just a season of life I was in. So my, I guess you could say my standard of living was adjusted. And I think understanding living within your means, like the some of the things I could say is look at one of the things I did was look at your retirement. You know, what are you going to lose out on from contributing from your salary job? A great thing is chat with a financial advisor. Look at that. I mean, they
Right.
are experts, right? This is what they do. So if
Right.
you're just like finances can be scary. It's like an icky thing, right? It's to know like what you spend and to like dive into that. Sometimes you're like, oh my God, I just spent like $50 on Starbucks in the last 2 weeks. Like, ooh, I don't like that. Like, that's a gross feeling, when I could have put $50 to my retirement or whatever. Sometimes putting shining a light on something on like your spending feels a little bit icky. So, yeah, what I did was I increased my retirement contributions.
Hmm.
And because I'm very like, when I'm doing something, I have the perspective in my mind is what is future Jasmine gonna thank me for what I'm doing today. So if I have this decision and I'm going back and forth, I'm thinking, okay, a year from now, 5 years, 10 years, when I'm 55, am I gonna be sitting there being like, why didn't you just contribute X amount of dollars, when you were 32, into our retirement? Because now I feel like we have to work and work and work longer and not enjoy, life and grandkids and all that stuff. So I have that in mind, and that's one thing that I did. Um, Another thing that's like really helped me is I've done things like meal plans, and that sounds like so simple, but that is literally saves you so much money. And hey, look, like I got diapers, I got formula, I got all these things that I just like I can't really cut down on because those are things that I need.
Right.
But for me, it's like meal planning is so easy to do. Like, I just have the calendar up, da 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 da. I do that. Um, and then, you know what? It's kind of like I thought it would be hard, but the trade-off, um, I love. Like, I love the fact that I don't need to put in a request to go see a dentist, or I don't need, I don't need to put a request in for a day off. I don't need to,
Sure.
so I think for me,
The
the
flexibility is
trade-off.
super. Yeah. The flexibility
Exactly.
is wonderful. But I want to just, before we move on from finance, though, you mentioned the
Mhm.
significance of being clear about what it is that you're trying to accomplish with your retirement fund, and then thinking about budget too, especially as it relates to food, or
Mhm.
whatever the monthly bills are. I think this brings up an important point, which is clearly establishing, and again, I'm guilty of the same, but it's very easy to get into a place where we just function robotically or kind of automatically, right? And not realize, especially if
Yeah.
we're used to having that so-called normal job that's generating a regular income, we have a regular schedule, and we know how we can function within that. Now things are getting ready to change. It's really, really important to stop functioning automatically, robotically, and to actually establish a really clear picture, financial picture for ourselves,
Yeah.
certainly in conjunction with a financial planner if you need that help as well, especially when it comes to long-term planning for savings and retirement and so forth. But establishing a really clear picture. Okay, this is where I'm at. And in order to maintain the existing lifestyle and to continue to be able to not only live the way that I do, but also take those vacations and put money into savings and contribute to retirement the way that I have been, this is how much I need to make. And oh, by the way, I have to consider the fact that I'm also going to have to pay pretty significant taxes on top of that. So
Yeah.
I need to up the ante even further in order to compensate for that. But establishing that clarity, again, going back to my original point, I think it's really important that we do that for the sake of mitigating the fear. If we don't have clarity, if we don't have understanding, and if we don't have direction, that's what I mean by clarity here,
Yeah,
then it's going to be a lot easier to fall into that mindset of questioning and ultimately fear and anxiety. So I think
yeah.
you bring up some interesting points in that regard. The other thing that you talked about, though, was worrying about what other people think. And I,
Hmm.
maybe you can just expound on that slightly, because part of me is like, you know what? I'm doing something as an entrepreneur, going and starting my own company, taking the risks associated with that most people don't do, number one. And
Yeah,
even those that do, in many cases, fail. So I'm actually taking a really big risk. And I mean, if I want to frame it this way, I'm not the norm, right? So I'm
yeah,
actually doing something that's a lot different than what those who have a so-called normal job are doing. I can actually take pride in that. And it's not about being better than, it's I'm taking a risk that a lot of these people aren't willing to take. I can be really proud about that. Certainly there's a little bit of anxiety that goes along with it, but I can be excited about it rather than being so worried about how people are going to judge me. That's kind of my initial thought process there, but I'd love to hear your kind of where those fears came from, where those concerns came from.
yeah. So, speaking of being in my 30s and having children and things like that, the big pushback and the big kind of not pushback, but the misunderstanding that I typically get is like, why would you want to leave a career that you love, that has salary, that has all these benefits and all these that to just go run your own business, Um, so knowing that people have these ideas of me, and look, my anagram, it's the achiever. My biggest downfall is disappointing people. So that's something that is always in the back of my mind, is figuring is having that fear of disappointing somebody. And we're also, as photographers,
But
you're in a
I would,
service-based
if I can
business.
jump in real quick,
Yeah.
if I can
Mhm.
jump in real quick, I'm curious, is it's, I mean, it's one thing to understand our tendencies, right? We can speak to an Enneagram or personality type, understand our tendencies. That's really what those are about. But the question still remains for me, why would I, and I don't have the answer, by the way. This is just a conversation. Why would I be worried about what other people think about me? I mean, that's a general deep dive that we need to do as individuals, right? To explore
Yeah.
where that's coming from. And
Yeah.
that will certainly help us in the context of this conversation. But how am I disappointing somebody else if this is not their business, their life, their choices? Why am I worried about what they think? And again, I'm just kind of putting the question out there. I'd love to get your thought
Yeah.
on that, your initial take on that.
Yeah, and I think when I mean disappointing people, I'm more so thinking about people that are close to me, like, a partner, a parent, that kind of, part. As for, like, afraid of what people will think, that's more of, like,
Hmm.
to the general public. And because we're in, a service-based industry, if you feel like you have this perception of, failing, then you have this idea that if what if people don't think I'm good enough? Then they're not going to book me. What if I try something and I fail? Then people won't book me. You have this that can get into your head when and I do have to say, like, in my 20s, this haunted me constantly. Um, in my 30s, it's very different. It's very different. And I'm like, I can't wait till I get into my 40s, in my 50s. Like, this is gonna be sweet, I'm gonna be
But what
like,
do you think
I
the
don't care.
difference is between when you were in your 20s and now in your 30s? Is it experience in life that helps you realize, oh, I don't have to actually worry so much about what people think, or
Yes.
what is it, do you think?
Yeah, definitely. I think it comes with age and experience and understanding. Um, kind of for me, from my perspective, it's kind of, again, living for that inner child. That's one of my whys. And it's not to say that, like, in your 20s you don't have this mindset. If you're in your 20s you have this mindset, that is amazing. Like, that is great. For me, it took me life experience. It took me situations, not great situations, where I came to this mindset. Like I discussed before on the newbie podcast. I believe I did. I do deal with anxiety and depression and ADHD, and the whole thing of that. So your mind just goes do 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 do. It creates this narrative of what you think people are, and then it generates these fears, right? These fears of like, what if, what if, what if, what if, and so that is the biggest obstacle. And like I said, the biggest obstacle is always yourself. It's not money. It's not money, because money you can always make more of. It's yourself and your mindset.
Yeah, that is really probably the most significant issue at hand. There's no question it's challenging to make money. And by the way, when I going back to my earlier comment about the pride that I can take in starting a business, the reality is well, certainly to get where I'm at this point, it took a very long time. But to even get a business off the ground to a place where
Yeah.
I'm generating enough revenue to be able to make a living, that's a massive challenge. So it takes a lot of work, to be very, very clear, especially for any new photographers listening in. But it is
Mhm.
important to learn how to manage our mind. There's a book I've mentioned a number of times on the podcast called Untethered Soul,
Mhm.
and there's a newer version of it by Michael Singer called Living Untethered, and it deals with that voice inside our head. And in our culture these days, it's very easy to put a label on this tendency that we have. And the reality is, most of us at the end of the day can actually learn. It may take a little bit of time, but we can learn to manage that more effectively. And Don on Facebook says, confidence in yourself and you grow. And that's where a lot of that confidence comes from, is being able to learn the insignificance, actually, because we give so much significance to that voice inside our head telling us this thing and that thing, right? That's just our
Yeah.
mind running rampant. But we have this ability as, and Singer talks about this in the book, but we have this ability as human beings to be able to observe those thoughts. So if we're able to observe those thoughts, that means now I can choose how to engage those thoughts. The same way that I can choose to pick up my phone here as an object, right? Or I can pick up this pen or this notebook that I've been taking notes on. And then I can set those things down. I have the same ability as an individual to be able to observe that narration in my head and then
Yeah.
choose how to engage with it. And it's a really powerful concept. And if we're able to understand that and begin to apply it to our life, then we can develop what Don was saying on Facebook, which is to have that confidence in ourselves. And as a
Yeah.
result, that will give us the freedom, right? We can set aside that anxiety and the constant narration and just focus on doing the things that we need to in order to build the business that we need to, certainly to achieve the financial goals that we've established for ourselves. We've established those clear financial goals. So I think
Yeah.
it's a really good conversation. And at the end of the day, I want to recommend to all of our listeners that book. Certainly, we'll link to it in the show notes at bokehpodcast.com as well. But I appreciate you kind of sharing that, really the fears and the challenges associated with
Yeah.
making this pivot. And really, they're very similar to those fears and challenges just in general of starting a business, right? When you try to get something off the ground, there are naturally a lot of apprehensions there. We're in the process right now, myself and my team, of launching a new company. We'll be launching in January. There are a lot of fear and apprehensions associated with it. But at the end of the day,
Yeah.
there's clear intention, there is strategy, and step by step, we're implementing that strategy, and we're going to go live in January, and ultimately take the world by storm. But that's for
Nice.
another day, another
Nice.
conversation for another day.
Well, and Nathan, I do want to say too that like with that, my biggest fear, and maybe this will resonate with any of your listeners too, is that I was afraid of making a mistake. And once I realized that mistakes are inevitable, and taking them as learning opportunities really, really shifts that mindset, and it quiets that voice in your head. You know,
Hmm.
I launched a course last month, and like I had pushback and I had all this stuff, and when I went into it, it was my first time launching it, and so I was very the expectations I set were different than than what I got, kind of things like that. Some are great, some people are not nice, but anyways, that's just
Yeah,
how
this
that's
is
how it
true.
is. It's how it is,
But
right?
I'll push back a little bit and say, and not necessarily to you, but I think in general, and maybe I'm just speaking to myself here. What I'm thinking about is there are times where I've gone into situations with fear.
Mhm.
And not only did that come from, as I mentioned earlier, a lack of clarity, right? So, what is it that I'm doing? Do I know how to do that thing? And do I know the direction that I'm going? Clarity. If I lack clarity, it's natural to go into something with more fear than even average individual.
Yeah.
If we've taken the time to prepare, we've established a clarity as to the direction that we're going, and what is needed in order to get to that place, then there is less reason for us to have that fear and that doubt going in. For example, and this is actually a really great example. So I mentioned earlier to those that may have missed it, that we're using a new platform today to do this interview. And we may or may not stick with it. I wanted to go ahead and experiment with it today, but I didn't just blindly open up this platform to do
Yeah.
this interview today 5 minutes before we got started in order to hold this interview. Because the last
Yeah.
thing that I need when others are relying on me to host a good show is to launch a platform and then try to figure the things out as I go. And there's naturally going to be way more fear associated with a situation like that. I've taken now what amounts to probably a couple of days or so testing on and off with one of our team members, Jill, who produces our podcast, testing with Jill, not only this platform, but other platforms. In fact, probably about, what was it, 30 minutes or so before, or an hour before we started, got on yet again for another testing session, spent time editing video and audio behind the scenes. There's plenty of preparation that goes in, but at some point, right? So there's the preparation that helps minimize fear. Naturally, there's a little bit of apprehension when we're doing something new. But I guess the reason I bring this up is I think a lot of times people may, and maybe I'm projecting here, but a lot of times people may go into a situation not prepared. They're not clear about what it is they're trying to achieve. They're not clear about what their brand is about. They're not clear about their target market that they're going to. They're not clear about the market opportunity. They haven't done research in the marketplace to know whether or not the market will support their business idea. There's a lack of clarity there. And you've got to have that clarity that will help mitigate fear. And then, yes, you're taking some chances still when you go live. I went live with this new platform today. We took the leap. We're trying to kind of build the wings on the way down, but I think we've
Yeah.
done okay so far. But a lot of that is because I prepared in advance, right? So
Yeah.
I think that's I don't want to harp on it too long, but I think it's important to note again that clarity is absolutely vital to help mitigate not only the fear, but also, as we were talking about, that voice inside our head. And
Yeah.
yeah, Dawn said on Facebook as well, she said, mistakes are lessons. You learn from them and grow. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think
Absolutely.
it's very easy to get caught up in this, like the cultural narratives, right? Like there's
Yeah.
a cultural narrative, which is everybody's awesome. Okay, well, that's kind of true, but it takes work to actually truly be awesome, or at least above average, right?
Yeah.
Or hey, mistakes are lessons. We'll learn from this as we grow. Well, yeah, true. But also don't just dive into the deep end without any kind of plan and preparation, right? There's some
Yeah.
balance to be had there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, if you think about wedding photography, I'm not going to book a client and say, okay, we'll see you in a year, and hopefully it all turns out great. Like, no, there's a process. There's a whole planning process I do with my clients. There's meetings. There's prep that I do as a professional photographer that they're paying for. I don't just cross my fingers and toes and hope that all my batteries are charged. Even though I never check them, like, I totally agree with that. Like, and I think with any situation, obviously there is a chance of things going wrong, but look at what's going to go right and understand that, like, the idea of something going wrong is always a possibility. It doesn't matter what any situation that you're in. And I think that's what held me back was afraid of doing something wrong or failing, and then
Sure.
not it being like, I can't take it back. But it's like, in my 30s, it's just like, no, I can make a mistake. Like, I can invest in a course and hope
Mhm.
that my return of investment is gonna, I'm gonna book X amount of weddings from it. And if I don't right away, then that's fine. What did I learn from this? And apply it to my business. I think I totally agree with what you're saying. I think you definitely need to go unprepared, and then when you go unprepared and you have that voice coming in, then you're reminding yourself, hey, look, I've done all the work. I've prepped. I've done everything that I can. I'm gonna try.
And that's it. You've done the prep in advance. So you have the ability at that point to hear and see that voice. Again, if we're treating that so-called narration or the voice inside our head like an object that we can choose how to engage with, I can
Yeah.
say, hey, you know what? That has little to no significance in my life at this point because I know I've done the work. And I guess my point ultimately, and it was a long-winded version of this point, but my point ultimately was that if we go in with preparation, we
Mhm.
can help minimize or mitigate that fear and that anxiety associated with taking a leap like this. And I think it's just a really important idea for our listeners to note. So on that
Yeah.
note, then let's kind of shift from the fear to the kind of the big ideas that ultimately drove you. And I'm sure we've touched on some of these already in the conversation, but you mentioned to me before we got started that you've got kind of 5 important ideas or principles that you've been able to apply to your business and life that enabled you to move beyond that fear and to make the pivot that you have. Will you share those with us?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I do want to say that when I left my teaching career, some people, and this is like a little side note, but I just want to say that when I left my teaching career, I gave up my contract. I loved what I did. I never left on a bad note. I'm always like, you know what? Maybe one day I'll go back. There's always that possibility, and that's not to say I feel like a failure or anything like that. But I do know some people leave their careers because they felt like they had no choice or they felt like they were pushed out. I was fortunate enough to leave on a good note. So I just want to put that out there. Um, Side note. But for, I guess, like the important principles or big ideas that kind of made me, make this move, I really, really got down to what my values are, what my why is, because that's super important. Understanding, like, what is the benefit of making this move? Why am I making it? For me, one of my values is freedom. With that comes freedom of time, freedom of choice. That to me, owning my own business and having my kids be so young right now, that just felt like there's a natural progression to me. So that's kind of one of them. Living
Okay.
up for my inner child, like I had talked about. And then my third one is living out for my cousin who had passed away when he was young, and so just living my life out for him as well.
Yeah, and for anybody who doesn't have context here, we had a somewhat similar conversation on the Newbie
Mhm.
podcast. So we touched on a couple of these things. So just to be clear, though, for those listeners who didn't hear that episode, clarity of values, number one.
Yes.
Um, two, you said the ability to be able to kind of live out your inner child. Do I understand that right?
Yeah, yeah. So, just the inner child for me, dealing with a lot of people pleasing, dealing with a lot of afraid of what people think and stuff like that. And so when I feel like when I'm put in those situations, I actually like resort back to that inner child. And I can find myself, and I don't know, maybe it sounds funny to people, but for me, I need to vocalize how I'm feeling, like out loud, whether that's literally driving by myself in a car and just talking out loud or whatever. That's just how I process things. But saying things like, "I got you, girl. Don't worry. Don't worry." And I can see this, my inner child just feeling like there's somebody sticking up for her, kind of thing. Oh, lost my earbud. But yeah, that's kind of
So
one of the
the
things.
ability then to be able to move beyond that inner child. We all have that in some version. In fact,
Yes.
I always
Yeah.
say I may be 43, but in my head I'm 14, and I
Yeah.
behave like it sometimes too. So I have to learn to kind of move beyond those tendencies, those learned bad habits, and
Yes.
ultimately, well, grow up. I say that with in air quotes because I think it's important actually to maintain some sense of curiosity and simplicity that a child has, and
Hmm.
ultimately, of course, that natural kindness that comes from all of that as well. But
Hmm.
there are certain behaviors that we have learned over time as we have grown up that we need to be able to move beyond. And so I think there's kind of a nice balance to be had there. So clarity of values, the ability to
Hmm.
move beyond our childhood tendencies or our inner child, and then number
Hmm.
three, you talked about was you had somebody close to you that had passed away as well, right? And this has
Hmm.
had a big effect on the choices that you've made.
Yeah, yeah. So he was 19 when he passed suddenly. And yeah, I think of him often, and I kind of think about the person that he would be now, the family that he would have, kids he would have, stuff like that. And I kind of made it a point for myself is to live my life for, in honor of him, because he never had the chance to. And that has helped put things in perspective because it has helped me with with my boundaries of how I want to spend my time. That has
Hmm.
really, really helped. And look, like I shoot weddings. Like we all know, majority of weddings happen on Saturdays, right? Do I want to give up every Saturday of of my life? No, and I won't. Like that's a boundary, and I know I won't. I know certain points of the year I'm gone for family things. I know, like I'm at the point now where I can say no and I'm okay with it. But sometimes we're not all in that position. And that comes back to, again, reflecting on my values, reflecting on my why, knowing that when I make a decision, am I living within my values? And hey, like I actually just had a situation this week where I felt like my values were being challenged, not challenged, but I had a decision to make, and I reflected back on my values, and the decision I made is actually going against my values a tad, but I reflected it on future, where this decision I make, where is it going to take me to the future? And will I be living in my values based on the decision I made today? And that, so that's what helped me. So knowing like, okay, I might miss a family situation, family event to go and shoot this wedding, but I know that this wedding is going to be a great opportunity for me, which is going to help me with my future values, you know? So that is kind of like, you know, that's why you got to have your whys. Like, I just can't stress that enough, because if you don't have your whys and your values, you're going to be just like making decisions kind of willy nilly. That makes me sound so old when I say that, but like willy
No,
nilly.
but yeah, it's
It's
true.
true.
Random,
Yeah.
yeah, haphazard behavior, random decision making is a result. Again, I mean, it sounds repetitive at this point, but of a lack of clarity. And
Yeah.
values ultimately give us clarity in the sense that they help us make decisions about where we're going because we understand what's most important to us. That's what values are at the root level. Tony Robbins talks about the significance of values as ideals that are
Yeah.
so important to us that they actually have an emotional effect on us. And when they have that emotional effect on us, then it tends to lead us toward action, behavior, actually doing something about those emotions.
Hmm.
That's what values are at the root level. I personally have 12 of them, and I think maybe you said the other day you have 4 or 5 of them, something like that. But it's
Yeah.
however many we have, having those values established does help give us direction, clarity. You couple that then with what we were talking about earlier, which is clarity about our financial goals.
Yeah.
That those two things together help then trickle down to the business model that we create and ultimately help us determine how we're spending our time day to day. So yeah, I don't think it's old fashioned at all. I mean, whatever words you use to describe it, I think it's actually a really great idea to focus on our values. That was
Yeah.
that point number one. Again, just to kind of review for everybody. Two was the ability to move beyond some of our tendencies, those that we may have gained as a child, certainly. Three, to look for, I guess the way that I would kind of sum up what you're describing is ultimately to look for perspective and inspiration either from others or from our experiences in life. I think that's really important. What's the fourth one?
Yeah. Well, that was kind of like one big one jumped into one. So sorry about
Oh, fair enough.
that.
No, no.
Okay.
Let, let,
Well, you
let-
know what?
let's finish
Yeah.
running through them.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm just gonna list them all, and then we can revisit any ones that you like. So the other one, you know, life comes in seasons, and embrace the season that you're in, whether that's busy or slow season. Mistakes are inevitable. Learn from them. Don't dwell on them. Give yourself grace. There's going to be numerous days where it's going to feel messy, and you know you just got to get through it. And then communication is a big one, and that when I'm talking about communication, I'm talking about with your partner. And if you don't have a partner, you know, make sure you're super clear with communication with your, you know, with yourself in general, how you're feeling. Check in with yourself. Um, I go to therapy. I use all of these resources because I want to be the best that I can be for myself, my family, and my clients. So, um, you know, looking into that and really taking care of yourself too. So,
Okay, so I'm taking notes. You'll have to help me then with this because I know you
great.
you said those first few were kind of built into one. So then I guess number two would be life comes in seasons. Is that right?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
yeah.
just like give a 30-second summary of what that means to you and how that's played out in your business.
Yeah, so I mean, there's two parts to it, right? Like for me, in this season of life, like I'm busy with two kids, but then there's also the seasons like of my business where I have my very busy seasons and I have a very slow season. And look, when I have slow seasons, I'm so used to go 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 go, and I become I know when I have my anxiety peaking because I become super impulsive, stuff like that. So I really kind of embrace that slow season, and I take a step back and I look at how do I want to use my time for my business in this season of life.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and certainly business, especially as wedding photographers, but in general, is definitely seasonal. We certainly deal with that even
Yeah.
at our editing company as well. So that's number two. Number three, then don't dwell on mistakes, and this is an important one. We've kind of touched on some of this already, but will you just give a little bit of context to that?
Yeah, so, mistakes used to eat me alive, like, it used to make me, lose sleep at night, and, maybe some people are listening and they'll be like, "Well, that's dumb," but, that's how it used to be, and, now it's like, "Okay, you know what? Yeah, that crap happened. Let's ask ourselves what we learned from it, and then let's move on, and, it is what it is, it happened, and let's move on from it, and now we know what not to do or where to go from here."
Yeah, I don't. Mistakes are a funny thing because, like our earlier conversation, or we discussed during our earlier conversation, it's easy to build something up in our head and make it bigger than it actually is, right?
Yeah,
When we realize that everybody is making, well, a couple of things. One, that everybody's making mistakes around us. So this is actually quite normal. And
yeah,
two, that in many, if not most cases, people aren't actually paying as close an attention to our mistakes as we think they are. It's a
no,
weird version of ego, right? Like we think people are paying that much
yeah,
attention to us that they're going to notice all these mistakes that we're so worried about. And the
yeah.
reality is that's probably not the case 75, 80% of the time.
No,
So
people
a little bit of
care about
perspective
themselves.
helps. Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah,
true. It's true. And that can be a good thing and a bad thing, but in this context, it can actually be a good thing for our sake because we don't have to
yeah.
actually have to worry about this nearly as much as we do. And then I think the last point that you made was communication, the importance of communication with our
Mhm.
significant others, certainly with ourselves, but our significant others or the important relationships in our life. How does that play a role in this process of being able to pivot effectively?
Yeah, this has been something, that we work on every day, and, outside of my business, it's a really important thing to have with your partner, but, for him and I, like, it's really important to for me, I feel like it's really important for him to understand how I'm feeling, doubts I have, and it's not for him to solve my problems, um, or to give me a solution or whatever. Sometimes I just need somebody to listen, and then understanding on the other side that he has a totally different perspective, and what he might say, or might not be what I want to hear, or might not be the right thing. So giving him a little bit of grace there too. But like it's you don't have a salary, you don't have a consistent income, so you need to have this communication line with your partner so that they understand how to how to budget, how to do all these things. Then and done, if you feel like nervous about sharing income or whatever, that's probably more to do with you than to do, with your partner. Maybe you're feeling like, I should be making more. I don't want to tell my partner because they're going to be disappointed or, whatever. And I think it goes back to giving yourself grace and just having that communication line that it's super important. I can't stress that enough in your relationships and having your own business because it gets tough. It gets tough and it will always get tough. But you know what? The more things that you deal with, the mountains or the problems that felt like mountains are going to become molehills, and that's just how it is.
Well, it really is important. It's a good note to end on to proactively manage the expectations of those around us in
Yeah,
this case. And it's especially important if you're doing life with somebody because
yeah,
there are obvious significant financial implications with starting a business or making a change in a career. And so having those open and honest conversations, certainly being willing to share the fears, the concerns associated with it so that you're ultimately on the same page, that's where you ultimately develop a more unified relationship and help minimize
hmm,
the possibility of conflict. Right, the lack of there are a couple of things that, from my experience over the years now and various serious relationships, I would say that number one, it's important to play on the same team.
yeah,
And that may sound a little bit simplistic or even childish, but the reality is most conflict comes from a place of it's me against them, right? So, in order to minimize the possibility that that's happening, you've got to be in a place that's unified. And that unification comes from exactly what you're talking about, the open communication, the open dialogue. and certainly proactive management of expectations. As clinical as that might sound, and maybe as business related as that might sound, it's important to do it on the relationship side as well. So thanks for
Yeah.
highlighting that, and ultimately for sharing with our listeners your experience, both the fears and ultimately how you face them. I think this is a really practical conversation. I appreciate everybody chiming in as well. And Jasmin, by the way, will you just remind our listeners, and I'll pop this back up as you're sharing it, but remind our listeners of your website and then social media as well, so that they can follow you there.
Yeah, totally. So my website is jcphotographysk.com, and then you can find me on Instagram at jcphotographysk. And yeah, I would love to hear from your listeners. Like I said, I'm really passionate about this. I really believe in community over competition, and just really working on your mindset, and again, giving yourself grace and taking a step back when you need to, because I think that's really important, to calm that, that squirrel mind, or whatever you want to call it. And yeah, it's not easy, but for me it's worth it, because I think having this independence, which is one of my values, in my life, it feels right. It really feels like I'm living in my purpose right now.
Well, again, I appreciate you being willing to share in all of this. We'll make sure to link, of course, to your website, to your social media as well in the show notes, bokehpodcast.com, BOKEH podcast.com, for anybody who's new to the show. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. Thanks again, Jasmin, for making time for all of us. And for those of you that are live streaming, I hope you have an absolute